A burglar broke into a house one night and he shone his flashlight around looking for valuables. He picked up an MP3 player, and just as he was about to put it in his sack, a strange embodied voice echoed from the dark saying, "Jesus is watching you. Jesus is watching you." Well, he nearly jumped out of his skin, clicked his flashlight off, and he froze right there. When he heard nothing more, he shook his head and promised himself a vacation after this big score, and then he clicked his flashlight back on. Again, he went around the room searching for more valuables. And just as he pulled out some cables to the laptop, clear as a bell, he heard it once again. "Jesus is watching you. Jesus is watching you." Totally rattled, he shone his light around frantically looking for the source of the voice. And finally, in the corner of the room, the flashlight beam came to rest on a parrot. "Did you say that?" he hissed at the parrot. "Yes," the parrot confessed and then squawked, "I'm just trying to warn you." The burglar relaxed a bit. "Warn me, huh? Who do you think you are, anyway?" "Moses," replied the parrot. "Moses?" the burglar laughed. "What kind of crazy people would name a parrot Moses?" And the bird promptly answered, "The same kind of people who would name a Rottweiler Jesus." Now, the truth is, Jesus is watching us. Even when no one else can see the games we play in our foolish pride, Jesus sees it and he calls it what it is. And that brings us to our passage of Scripture this morning in Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. I'd invite you to turn your Bibles with me to Luke chapter 14. The setting is in the home of a Pharisee. Not because the Pharisee was a big fan of Jesus, but so that he and his fellow Pharisees may watch Jesus and perhaps catch Jesus breaking the law of Moses. And so Jesus is invited to a dinner of a prominent Pharisee. And the whole thing reeks of a setup. In Luke 14, verse 1, it tells us that Jesus, was being carefully watched. But as we're going to see, it is Jesus watching them. So as Jesus sits around the dinner table, there are three items on the menu: hypocrisy, humility, and hospitality. And what we're going to see over dinner is Jesus is going to unmask their hypocrisy. He's going to underscore their lack of humility. And he's then going to uncover their selfishly motivated hospitality. He does all of that at one dinner. Now, we have been looking at a sample of Jesus' unforgettable stories. They're called parables. And they're called parables because they're stories placed alongside of a truth to illustrate that truth. Each story is told in its larger context, and it's really helpful to know why Jesus told the story. Well, in our passage here in Luke 14, we don't have to guess as to why Jesus told this story. He explicitly tells us. And so in order to get really the most of this parable we're looking at this morning, that really begins in verses 7 and 8, it's worth noting that the parable comes on the heels of Jesus unmasking their hypocrisy. So I want to go back to verse 1 and 2 of Luke chapter 14. We need this bigger context. Luke 14, verse 1. It says, "One Sabbath, when Jesus went out to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy," which, by the way, is just this abnormal swelling of the body. Now, did you notice here, it just so happened to be on this Sabbath day. It just so happened that on this Sabbath day, Jesus is in the house of a prominent Pharisee, and there was a man there who had dropsy. What a coincidence. No. This man who had dropsy was a pawn in their game. It's a setup. It's an entrapment. A diseased man would never be allowed in the home of a Pharisee. See, Pharisees of that day might be similar to what we think of when we hear the word fundamentalist. Pharisee comes from a word that means separated. Oh, and they were good at that. They separated themselves from the riffraff of society, the lowest classes of people. They had a divide between the holy and the unholy. They had a divide between the rich and the poor. They had a divide between the honored and the despised. They viewed others in a condescending fashion as contemptuous and as ignorant and as beneath them. And at this time, there were probably around 6,000 of them running around. 6,000 Pharisees. So the trap is set of a man needing help on the Sabbath. Now, by the way, there is no prohibition for healing on the Sabbath in the Bible. It's just their own embellishments. And Jesus calls them out on that in verse 3. He asks the question, okay, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Notice their response, but they remain silent. Jesus is unmasking their hypocrisy. Jesus heals this man. And then he asks them this question in verse 5. He asks them, if one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out? What are they going to say to that? Well, verse 6 tells us what they said to that. And they had nothing to say. I love that. They had nothing to say. And this is why, when Jesus was invited to the home of a Pharisee, he was never invited back. It was one and done every single time. They try to trap him. He exposes their hypocrisy, and they have nothing to say. They have nothing to say. Well, Jesus had plenty to say. First issue on the table is hypocrisy. The second item on the menu is humility. I love how verse 7 starts out. It says, when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. Now, I want to just for a second compare these words in verse 7 with the words in verse 1. Verse 1 said, one Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, get this, he was being carefully watched. And so while they're watching him closely, Jesus was watching them. He noticed, because Jesus is watching. He's watching and waiting for that moment when they would reveal their self-promoting hearts, and there it was, right in front of him. There is this mad scramble for the best seats. And this is what sets off 2 dinner lessons. That's why Jesus told this parable, right here. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. 2 dinner lessons. 2 dinner lessons. Dinner lesson number 1, it really matters what seats you choose. It really matters what seats you choose. So he says in verse 8, and he's speaking, by the way, to the invited guests, the experts in the law, and he's speaking to the Pharisees. He just might be speaking to us here too if we listen. It says, when someone invites you, verse 8, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this man your seat. Then humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you'll be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. Now, it might be helpful right here if we get a picture of what the seating might look like in that day. Typically, there would be this long table in the middle of the room. This long table in the middle of the room. And then around the table, there would be this U-shaped seating. The seat, the key seat, would be at the bottom of the U. That's where the host would sit. Then in importance, the guest would sit on his right and on his left, and then it would begin to flow all the way down to the least important people being seated way down at the other end. Way up here, way away from the U. Now the setting in Jesus' story is not just an ordinary dinner party, it's a wedding feast. And the similarity to our day would be what is often the case at a wedding reception. You'd have the head table where the bride and groom would sit, and then the wedding party would either sit there or they'd be close by, and then the closest family members would be near the head table. Further back were those people you were obligated to invite. I mean, those people that you weren't as close to. I've sat in those seats before. One time I didn't even have the same tablecloth as everybody else. Now, what was different in that day is that you didn't pick up your card on your way into the reception with your numbered table on it. There wasn't a sign that said reserved. No, the host determined as you entered where you would sit. And the closer you were to the host, the more honor you had. That's the seat you wanted. And you see, they lived in this honor-shame kind of society. That was their mindset. Honor, shame, honor, shame. It would be humiliating to sit in one of those honored seats because you scrambled to get there before everybody else. To only find out that the host had someone else in mind for that seat. And that host has to come up to you and ask you to leave. It's humiliating. Honor, shame, you'd be shamed. It'd be better, Jesus says, to choose the lousy seats and then be asked to move up closer by the host. You see, it really matters what seats you choose. Now, this isn't teaching on proper etiquette. Jesus isn't giving them advice on how to be a better hypocrite. This isn't simply some practical advice for getting the best seat. Feign humility, and then you'll be moved up. Sounds good? Jesus drives home his point in verse 11. He says, verse 11, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Now, folks, this is not a mechanism. This is not a mechanism to work the system. This isn't about making it look like we are humble so that we get an upgrade. Because pragmatically, I'm afraid we just might think this way. I want to be honored, so I'll jump through this hoop called humility, and I'll get the recognition and honor I really want. If that's the game you're playing, Jesus sees right through it. And he calls it pride. Pride's quite slippery, is it not? Pride has been called a master of masquerade. It can be so easily disguised. Even our good deeds can have a twinge of, what a good guy I am. We can even be proud of our humility. We'd write the book, Humility and How I Attained It. Like the pastor who said he had a wonderful sermon on humility and he was waiting for a large crowd before preaching it. Uh-oh. Pride just sneaks in with such subtlety. And so while we may kind of shake our heads at such blatant behavior by these Pharisees as they scramble for the best seats, if we're honest, we must admit we do the very same thing. We just try and disguise it a little bit. It shows up in many forms. We cut someone else down to make ourselves look better. We name drop to impress others. All too often, our decisions are influenced by what others will think of us rather than what is right. Keeping up the appearances often wins out over transparency. We push our way to be with people who can help us feel better about ourselves. We, and I'm saying we, often carry this invisible sign that reads, "Make me feel important." Pharisees were status seekers. They did whatever they could to elevate their importance in the eyes of others. To them, that's how they defined success. I like the words of John Johnson. He defines success this way. He says, "Success is attaining cultural goals that are sure to elevate one's perceived importance in that culture." Did you catch it? One's perceived importance. I don't know who said it, but I like it. He said, "If I could buy that man for what he's worth and then sell him for what he thinks he's worth, I could make a fortune." I ask myself, do you have an elevated view of yourself? Do you have an elevated view of yourself? On a small plane were only 3 passengers, a pastor, a Boy Scout, and a computer expert. The plane was going down, but there were only 3 parachutes and 4 people, including the pilot. The pilot announced that he should have one of those parachutes because I have a wife and 3 children, so he took one and jumped. The computer whiz then stood up and boasted, "I should have one of those parachutes because I am the smartest man on this plane and everyone needs me." So he took one and jumped. Pastor turned to the Boy Scout and he said, "Well, son, there's only one parachute left. You're young and I've lived a full life, so why don't you take the remaining parachute and I'll go down with the plane." The Boy Scout replied, "Relax, Pastor. The smartest man on the plane just picked up my backpack and jumped." Not so smart. Are you thinking of yourself more highly than you ought? Everyone needs me. Jesus says, verse 11, "You will be humbled." Feeling indispensable? I have, and I'm not away from it. Is the need to be needed running your life? Who might you consider to be beneath you? Pride might be sneaking in. Do you feel yourself getting annoyed because someone else is being praised? Might be a sign of pride. Are you bugged because someone else is getting the recognition you think is rightly yours? Watch it. Might be pride. Are you scrambling for the best seats, trampling others if you have to get the honor you think you deserve? In what way are you attempting to elevate yourself, your self-worth? Now listen, in our day, we worship. We worship. And I'm going to run the risk of being misunderstood. I don't really care. We worship self-esteem and self-expression. It's particularly evident in child rearing. We are breeding a generation that believes they have every right to be at the center of the universe. Much of parenting today is child-centered. We bend over backwards to give children the pride of place and honor. Scramble for the best seat, son. You deserve it. Go. Now, I'm not suggesting we go back to the mentality of kids should be seen and not heard. I'm not saying that. But we do them a disservice when we make them the central object of our attention. Because what happens when they discover there are not enough places at the top of the hill for everyone? What happens when they are asked to take a lower seat than what they felt they deserved? What then? Isn't this matter of picking the best seats, doesn't it come down to what we think we deserve? I deserve this. I deserve better than this. So we fight for the best seats. We exalt ourselves because we deep down think we deserve it. God is the one who does the exalting. If we try and do the exalting, we will only discover the painful consequences of being brought down low. A young seminary graduate was invited to speak in a church in the area, and he came up to the pulpit very confident and smug. He was well dressed, and he knew he had what it took to give a great message. He was ready to impress his audience with his Bible knowledge and his polished delivery. As he began to speak, the words simply wouldn't come out. He tried again, and there was nothing. So embarrassed and humiliated, he left the platform in tears. There were two ladies sitting in the front row, and one remarked to the other, if he'd come in like he went out, he would have gone out like he came in. That's profound. Because in other words, start humbly and God will move you up. Start arrogantly and God will move you down. See, true humility takes us to the cross of Christ. It brings us to that place where we're well aware of our unworthiness. If you're here this morning and you say, you know what, Pastor, pride's not a problem with me. I don't think very highly of myself. I think pretty lowly of myself and beat up on myself all the time. I'd have you consider how that too can be a form of pride. Samuel Shoemaker put it this way. He said, you can never have real humility while you are preoccupied with yourself. And an inferiority complex is the most self-centered state of mind in the world. See, humility is having a right, correct estimation of ourselves in God. It really matters what seat you choose. Now, you would think that right here that Jesus has kind of ruffled enough feathers at one dinner. You'd think dinner's over. Well, Jesus is not done. His first dinner lesson was for the guests. He now speaks to the host. Dinner lesson number 2 is it really matters who you invite to dinner. Dinner lesson number 2 is it really matters who you invite to dinner. We pick it up in verse 12. Look with me at verse 12. And Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. Well, there go all our church potlucks right there, gone. Well, Jesus continues, verse 13. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, when you come to a passage like this, the tendency is to read these words at the exclusion of all the other passages of Scripture. The tendency is to forget it's a parable. It's meant to illustrate one truth, and we kind of go off the deep end. And we say what I just kind of jokingly said, there go all the potlucks. Can't invite any friends over anymore. That's what it says. Hang on. Jesus is not saying, don't ever invite your friends or family over to dinner. He is not saying you can never have a family reunion. He is not saying we can't have church picnics. What he's using here is an idiom, a figure of speech that means to not only. To not only. Do not only invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors. That's the idea here. We could even translate it this way. When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not always keep inviting your friends. Don't do that exclusively. Now, to better understand Jesus' point, it would be helpful to know briefly a little bit more about the culture in that day. Their whole system was built on reciprocation. It was the old, I'll scratch your back and then you scratch my back mentality. I'll elevate you, and then when the time comes, you'll elevate me. Jesus playing off that first parable and the lesson there. If you were to get the most honored seats, then it meant you first honored that person. The whole thing became a sense of obligation. Look, honey, we got an invitation to the Joneses. Huh? You know what that means, don't you? We're going to invite the Joneses over now. And when you're making out your invitations, if you knew so-and-so couldn't reciprocate, off the list they go. You didn't invite them. You would invite people who could reciprocate. And the more extravagant the reciprocation, the closer you sat to the host. Do you see it here? It is all what? Self-serving. Jesus is saying, we're to focus on inviting people over who can't do anything for us or who won't be impressed with our temporary things. He's saying here, use hospitality to make eternal investments. Invite those to your home who can't repay you. Invite those, reach out to those who can't do anything for you in return. And Jesus says, you will be blessed if you do this. What a radical thing for Jesus to say. It really matters who you invite. Is it centered around reciprocation, repayment in this life, or repayment at the resurrection? You might recall the two disciples, James and John. They came to Jesus once and they asked, who's going to sit in those places of honor? Same idea here. Who's going to sit closest to God here in the next kingdom? Who's going to sit there? James and John asked this. One passage said moms were involved. Well, poet Robert Raines reminds us that we're like those disciples in many ways. He says, I am like James and John, Lord. I size up other people in terms of what they can do for me, how they can further my program, how they can feed my ego, how they can satisfy my needs, give me strategic advantage. I will exploit people ostensibly for your sake, but really for my own sake. I am like James and John. Treating others kindly, as long as we're being treated right by them, it is not love. It is a business transaction. The way of Christ is to do good to those who will give us nothing in return. It is love that gives without strings. And we must fight this natural, universal tendency to act for the greatest earthly payoff. Our inviting, our giving, our moving toward others in love, folks, will not always be reciprocated. What's to be our motivation, repayment, when we stand before Jesus? I ask, How are you living? How are you giving for the earthly repayments of convenience, the earthly repayment of ease, the earthly repayment of comforts, the earthly repayment of what you can get back in return here and now? Church, we must fight against that. Luke 6, verse 32. I think you're familiar with these words. Luke 6, verse 32, Jesus says, "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that." If we live by the reciprocal principle, we are no better than the world. That's what Jesus is saying. The way of Jesus is to do for others with no strings. And that is just absolutely counterintuitive thinking. It will take what Jesus has already been talking about: humility. Humility. It really matters who we invite. Jesus is saying, rather than invite those who will in turn elevate you to a place of honor, instead humble yourselves and love on those who will give you zip in return. Anybody come to mind? A mother found under her plate one morning at breakfast a bill made out by her son Bradley, aged 8. Mother owes Bradley for running errands, 25 cents. For being good, 10 cents. For taking music lessons, 15 cents. For extras, 5 cents. Total, 55 cents. Mother smiled but made no comments. At lunch, Bradley found the bill under his plate with 55 cents with it, and another piece of paper neatly folded like the first. Opening it, he read, "Bradley owes Mother for nursing him through scarlet fever, nothing. For being good to him, nothing. For clothes, shoes, and playthings, nothing. For his playroom, nothing. For his meals, nothing. Total, nothing." Give expecting nothing. Let God do the exalting. Our attitude is to be like Christ, Paul says in Philippians 2, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. The one who possessed everything became nothing. How hard is it to live that way? I find it incredibly difficult. We don't want to be nothing. We want to be something. We don't like that word, nothing. Nothing is for nobodies. We like to think of ourselves better than we are, and really, we are no better than the lowest of the low. And every single day, and several times in a course of a day, we are faced with a choice to move down, to be nothing. How much of our serving is self-serving? That's convicting. Are you willing to inconvenience yourself for someone who can't repay? Are you willing to love someone who doesn't have much to give back? Listen, it all begins with humility. It all begins with humility. Jean Vanier tells the true story of a man he knew who lived in Paris. His wife had Alzheimer's. This man was a very important businessman, and his life was filled with busyness. He was always on the move, making business transactions. He worked all around the country and beyond. Well, when his wife fell sick, he said this: He said, I just couldn't put her into an institution, so I kept her at home. I fed her. I bathed her. I have changed. I have become more human. The businessman took care of his wife day after day after day in unconditional love. He got little to nothing in return from her. He tells of one time, in the middle of the night, his wife woke him up. She came out of this fog for a very brief moment, and she said, darling, I just want to thank you for all you're doing for me. And she fell back into the fog. And he said, and I wept, and I wept, and I wept. Many around us live in a fog of disabilities and poverty and addictions and spiritual blindness. As we serve them, listen, we may only receive fleeting glimpses of gratitude. We're called to love people who cannot love us in return. Let's stoop to love and let God take care of the exalting. I ask you, is there someone to whom you need to be more inviting? Is there someone you have trampled over in order to get a seat of honor? In what situation that you're in right now do you need to humble yourself? Let's pray.